And we're going to actually build up a real test case here. Right? So we took one module, we split it apart into multiple modules. And the whole point there is about reusability. Okay, when I'm building a test case, a real test case up, I'm able to use these modules basically like little Legos, little building blocks, to make that test case do what I want. And some of these things I might want to reuse, right? Like definitely starting the app and closing the app is a great example of that. So how do we use them, right? Well, first things first, let's maybe give our test case a better name. Our test is about adding a user, right? So I'm going to call this my add one user test case. And again, I just slow double click to rename it here. And like anything else, it has to be one word. So you might want to use underscores or capitalization to kind of distinguish. And again, just like everything else you name, it's totally up to you. It has no bearing whatsoever on your test, so feel free to make it your own. All right, and we already have close app in there. Why is that? Well, if you remember the very beginning, we had test case and recording one. We renamed recording one, and that's why we see it's close app now. All right, now I'm going to take these little building blocks here, these modules, easier. I mean, you could do it from either view here, but it's a little bit easier maybe in this module browser, this bottom view. And I'm just going to drag and drop them into this folder. So let's think we need start app first. So I'm going to take start app, click and hold it. And if you drag, you'll see this little black line appearing. You can also just drop it right into the folder. But obviously the sequence will matter here, so you have to move things around a bit. Just practice that a little bit. It's not necessarily the most intuitive thing at first, but just practice dragging a module in there and kind of moving it around. Obviously the order does matter, but the good news is you don't have to get it right the first time. You can change things around. Okay, so we have start, we have close. In the middle there, I want to go to database tab, right? That's required first before we actually add a user. We have to be on the right view. All right, and then we're going to add one user. So grab that guy and drag it over. And then obviously we want to validate, we want to test, right? So drag validate, put it next. And you should get something like this. Now this does exactly what recording one did, right? We just kind of split it up. And again, that's all about reusability. So real quick, before we go on break here, we're going to create another test case. It's going to be kind of a silly example. But just to show you that we can reuse these things, if I want to create another test case, I do so from the test suite. So everything's contextual here, right? A test suite contains test cases. So if I want to create a new test case inside of it, I want to highlight the test suite. And you can either right click or you can use this add dropdown. Now I'm more of a fan of the right click menu personally, because again, then it makes it kind of more obvious that it's contextual. And so if I right click the test suite and I go to add, I can see new test case there. We'll talk about smart folders after break. Right, if I'm highlighting a test case though and I go to add, I don't see that. I can't create a test case because you can't have a test case inside of a test case. Okay, so that's why I'd like the right click menu. It's just a little more obvious what's contextual, what's not. But obviously, it takes some getting used to. You'll learn more over time. It'll just become natural. So let's go ahead and add a new test case into our test suite. And it's going to be kind of a silly one, but I'm going to call it the open close test case. We'll build a more complex one after break here, but for now, I just want to prove that, yes, we can reuse these modules. And just give you a little muscle memory here as well on creating a test case, for example. Open close, well, what do we need? We need the start app module. Again, I used it here in this first test case, but I'm also going to use it here, the same exact thing. So just take start app, drag it. Now the first time you try to add something, you have to drop it in like you're dropping a file into a folder. So again, maybe takes a little practice to get used to, but once you have a module in there, now you can start using that black line to define the sequence, the order. Kind of a silly example, right? But we're going to use start and then close. Just to make it a little interesting, maybe I'll do go to database in the middle for no reason. Okay, a silly test case, no doubt, but I wanted to show you that yes, we can recycle these, right? This start app is the same as this start app. They're both pointing to the same file. They're kind of like references over here. You want to think of it that way. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. If I need to change at any point in the future, let's say I had 100 test cases that all use the start app module. Well, suddenly now we need to change the way we launch the app. Well, if I don't have this framework here, this keyword, really that's what it is, a keyword driven framework. If I didn't have that built in, right, I would have to come to each test case individually and update it maybe. But now I change one file and it updates everywhere that it is being used. Okay, so it's a huge part of our framework. Hopefully the simple example here gives you the idea, but we're going to use this obviously going forward as well to basically be able to build up test cases. The gold standard or the goal, I guess, is that once I have enough of these modules built up and fleshed out, right? Let's say I build my regression test suite and I'm testing all these different functionalities. Well, when new features come along, right, I need to add them to the regression test. Well, maybe it's only a few additional steps that I need to add, right? Maybe I already have 90% of what I need, like opening the app, logging in, navigating to a certain view, right? And I really only need to add a couple of new steps, a new module, let's say, for the new functionality, right? So in the beginning, obviously, you're creating everything from scratch, but the idea is that over time, you're able to build up test cases rather quickly because you're going to be reusing a lot of stuff you already have. That's the dream anyway, and that is what we call modularization. Any question about reusability or our modules, what they mean? Yeah, this part's pretty straightforward, I think. I'll give it a quick run just to show you that we do get a little bit of a different report. All right, so up until now, when we run things, we've basically been running just a recording module. Now we're going to actually run the test suite, and you can only do that from the test suite view. And so this run button here, now this run button and this run button at the moment are the same thing, right? Because I only have one test suite, so running here is the same thing as running here. But that will change in the near future. We'll have multiple test suites here, and not until day 3, but basically click run. Either one works, and you'll see a difference, right? We're not just running a recording module now; we're running a full-blown test suite. And as such, you'll see a little command prompt pop up here, and it says database test.exe. That is my artifact, really. That I mentioned in the beginning, right in the slides, that your test at the end of the day is just an executable file. So when I hit run, that's all that's happening. It compiles my test into an exe and runs that exe. So you could probably already assume, right? You can already guess that clicking the run button is one way to do it, but I can also just go to that exe file and double click it, for example, in my file explorer. All right, now I know mine always works, and I'm not going to be that guy who says works on my machine. We'll figure out what's going on with the system. At least we have a couple working systems, right? So we kind of know what we can mimic or clone. Hopefully get everyone working. Chris said, works on my machine. Yeah, that's usually the developer saying that, right? We found this bug. Well, hey, it works on my machine, so not a bug. No, I won't do that to you. We'll figure out. We'll get to the bottom of why that's going on. But hopefully you're at least getting the idea here. And like I said, if only for the muscle memory of dragging things around and all that, that's 90% of the battle, really. So some of you might have to just use your imagination and say, yeah, it ran. and did exactly what it's supposed to do. But on that note, we're right about halfway, guys. So this is about the good time. Yeah, developer bingo, I love it. This is about a good time to take a quick little coffee break or tea time, I guess, right? And a little bio break. Let's say we give it 18 after, a little 10-minute break. Give everyone a rest. I'll pause the video and I'll be back before that in case there's any questions. But other than that, I'll see you guys back in about 10 minutes. Sound good? All right.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, I'll pause the recording and I'll see you guys here shortly. All right, we're recording again. Welcome back from break, guys. So where we left off, we talked about modularization. By the way, everything we're doing here, right, we have the templates for. So just so you know, if you're going through any of these hands-on exercises, let's say at your own pace, watching the videos later, and you want to check your work, then the template, which would be where we left off here, the final product would be database test modularized, and that solution there, right? If you did follow along with me, you don't need to open it, the template here, but just so you know, like I said, if you're going at your own pace there and you want to check your work, that's how you can do it. All right, for the next thing we're going to do is data driving. So this will be kind of the last part of the basics. Knowing how to record, knowing how to split things up, and lastly, knowing how to data drive a test are really the three things that you should definitely know on day one, right? So if you want to be getting productivity through the roof, knowing those three things is, really 80% of what you got to know in the beginning. So let's talk about data driving. What is data driving, right? The idea here is that I'm going to feed a test case some data. Right? At the moment, our test case does what it needs to do, but it only adds the same user every time. Right? And that's in the add one user module is where we do basically all the data entry. So if you want to jump into the add one user module, right, we're adding the same user each and every time. That's whoever you have here. It might be Ranorex champion. In my case, it's Jason Branham. Every time he's going to be management. Every time he's going to be age 36. So let's make this test work for a number of different users, right? It's pretty common that when you're testing a functionality, sometimes testing it once isn't enough. Sometimes you got to run it through its paces, make sure it works for multiple different parameters, right? Multiple different variations. And so we're going to data drive this. We're going to make it put in a different user each time. And there's really 3 steps to this, so it's not that bad. And step 1 is always done inside of the module, so at the action level, if you will, where we're going to create variables instead of hard-coded values, if you want to call them that. So instead of typing in Jason, for example, what I'm going to do is come to this key sequence action where I'm typing into the first name field. Instead of typing in this value, I'm going to drop it down here. You'll see a little drop down, and you'll see the option in there as a new variable. Step 1 is let's create our variables. Let's start with first name here. We'll say as new variable. And all I got to really do is give this thing a name, a variable name. So, as with anything else, you want to make it somewhat obvious as to what it is. And you don't have to put var in front of it or anything like that. That's just an old habit of mine. So I'm going to call it var fname. So I'll know this is the first name variable. But feel free to call it whatever you like. And go ahead and click OK. It's always good to have a good default value as well, but you can just leave whatever's in there. Probably don't have it blank, but give it some kind of default value. That way, in case the data goes away somehow, we still have something to fall back on. And we click OK. That's as easy as it is. You're basically just giving these variables names. Okay, so now it says key sequence of var fname. And I'm going to do the same thing for last name, right? So find the other key sequence action where you're targeting last name. Drop it down. You'll notice you can reuse variables, but in this case, right, we do want a distinct last name, so we will create a new one and call it var L name. Works for me. We'll do one more simple one here, which is going to be the age. So find your next key sequence action. Should be number 8 there, if you split them up like I did. And that is going to be some value in there, but we're going to drop it down and say as new variable. And this is going to be var age. And yeah, good default value. Obviously, you want it to be numeric, right? Sometimes that matters. Maybe this field doesn't support alphabetic characters or something. So be careful with your default value sometimes. There you go. So those are the easy ones. We created variables for all 3 of our key sequence actions. Now this last one is going to be a little bit more tricky. And that is when we pick a department. So action 5 opens that list of departments. Action 6 chooses the department. And this is the one thing we want a data drive that's going to be a little bit more difficult, at least not as straightforward as the key sequence. Because what we need to do here is actually variabilize the identification of the object. Okay, so right now it's saying mouse click management, and that's all it's ever going to click. But what we can do is change that management object to be basically finding an object based on, it looks like in this case, text, right? If we look down at the management object, again, if you highlight the action, it's an easy way to find it. Should be the last thing in your repository there. All right, without getting too complicated just yet, what we're going to do is change this path. You can see right now the path says list item. So find me a list item basically where the text is equal to management. Okay, now normally you'd want to confirm this type of thing. We'd use what's called the spy tool, but just trust me and basically know that the only thing we really need to change about this path, we still want to keep it list item. We still want to keep it text, but what the text is what we're trying to change, right? So if we want to point to sales, for example, we would say list item at text equals sales. Support, we would say list item at text equals support. Right, so the thing that changes is that value there, and we can create a variable there instead. Now, once you get a little more advanced, you can actually you could type into this path directly. That is possible, and you just use a dollar symbol to create a variable. But a little bit more, let's work through the UI here. Let's take it easy. Another way to do this is to click the Edit and Spy button next to that management object. So go ahead and give that a click. This is going to open up the Ranorex Spy tool, which we will use a lot tomorrow, by the way. Not so much today, but here's our first introduction to it. Now, Spy basically shows us what our path does, right? So that path information we have off to the right there, it shows it up here, and it also shows us, can we find that object? So right now we can't, right? Which makes sense because our application's not running. But honestly, I don't need to confirm it here. Naturally, you would want to confirm it, that it still works once you make a change, but again, for the moment, just trust me. And what we're going to do is, you can see it off to the right here. It says text equals management. Well, we're going to take that little drop down there, just like we did the key sequence actions, basically, and say, well, instead of being management every time, let's make a variable here, actually in the path. So go ahead and click As New Variable from that drop down there. You could probably guess the name. It's going to be var department. Definitely good to have you obviously need a default value that will work here. So I want it to be an actual department that I can choose as my default. So we'll just leave it management. And click OK. Okay, so you can see the difference, the new path versus the old path there. And yeah, anytime you see a dollar sign and the green text, that should be a very obvious indicator that it is a variable. And we'll just basically hit apply here. So either hit apply in the top right portion there, but don't worry, if you just close it, it'll also say, hey, you made changes, do you want to apply? Make sure you hit yes. Okay, and you should see it now. It's a little harder to notice in the repository compared to up here because that green text kind of goes away until you're highlighting it, then it comes back. But yeah, so this is now a data-driven object. And a good practice at this point would be to rename it, right? It's not going to be management every time. So again, renaming these is totally up to you. You don't have to. But just so when I'm reading these actions, right, I don't say, well, I'm clicking management. Well, that's not necessarily true anymore, right? It could be clicking anything. So it's not a bad idea to maybe rename this to something more generic like department. Again, that's just basically for my, setting my own expectations so that when I say, okay, 6 clicks on department, you might even put it, you might even make it more obvious, like some department or some variable department, some parameterized department, right? If you want to make it really obvious, not a bad idea. Okay, but that's step one. Step one is setting up the variables. We set up 4, 3 key sequences and 1 actual in our object path. And for the ladies, right, we could do the same thing here with radio button as well. It'd be the same approach as department, but we'll leave it off for now just to save some time. All right, and we're going to go to our test suite view for steps 2 and 3. So step 1, you always do at the action level or the object level. And step 2 and 3, you do back out at the test suite view. So go ahead and use that big green folder button again. Off to the right of add one user, you can see 4 unbound variables. And basically steps 2 and 3, we're going to create a data source, as we call it. Right? Basically point to some data source. And step 3 will be to connect or bind that data source to my variables. So step 2, let's get there first. We have to create a data source. You can only do that when you're highlighting a test case folder. So you actually see this little data source button that's up underneath the run button, and it only becomes enabled once you highlight a test case folder or a smart folder, which I'll talk about next. But right, you have to be highlighting the right thing for that to appear. Or again, you can right click. Using the right click menu, you get the same option. And if I right click a module, I don't see it. If I right click a test case, I do see it. So either way, using the button or the right click menu, let's open up the data source menu here. All right, now nothing has been created yet. Normally, if you have multiple data sources, you'd see them here in the middle drop down, but we don't have anything yet. Now, Ranorex can auto-generate it for us, but actually I want to show you how to connect to an external data source, as we call it. So a file we already have. And actually, in your training programs folder is such a file. You don't have to do this part with me. I just want to show you that in training programs, there is a CSV, a comma-separated value file. Okay, so there's multiple types we support, and I'll show you all of them, but we're going to use a CSV. And if I just want to give you a quick peek at it, now if you have Excel installed, it will actually open in Excel. I'll show you the other option, or the other way it looks. All right, but basically, and whether you're using you could even use an Excel spreadsheet, right, an XLSX file. Either way, what's basically going to happen is the first row is always going to be reserved for your column names, right, your column headers. So I have a first name column, a last name column, a department column, and an age column. You notice I gave them the same name as I name my variables. You don't have to do that, but it is a good idea. And then every subsequent row is just different first names, different last names, different departments, different ages. Okay, so this is kind of how you'll design a data source. Again, if you don't have Excel, Let me just show you here. Then this thing is just a comma separated value file, and it looks, let me just open it in some text editor here. And it looks like this. So same concept. First row is going to be your column titles, your column headers, and then every subsequent row is going to be the actual data of that column. Yeah, your data can look like this. That's the simplest version, I guess, of a data source. It's a comma separated value file. And that's what it looks like. So just to show you what that file looks like. And what I'm going to do in Ranorex is basically point to that file. Okay, now I need to create a new data source. There's no existing one. So off to the left here, you have the new dropdown. Now your four options are a simple data table, which is the same thing you get if you do that auto generate. Right, it's basically just a structure you create inside of your Ranorex project. It's going to be XML based, but you're going to create it from scratch if you choose that, right? So you're going to have to add all the columns, add all the values. We already have something existing, so what we're going to use is one of these three external data connectors. In our case, it'll be the CSV connector. And if you have a spreadsheet, you'll use the Excel connector. If you want to connect to a live database, you can do so with the SQL connector. Now that does require you know a little bit about SQL, namely just select statements, so not much. But basically you need to know a little bit about select statements so you can pull, right, the appropriate data that you want, not just the whole database. So in our case, we'll go with CSV, but if you guys are interested, we can also take a look at the other options a bit later here. Let's choose the CSV connector, and really all I have to do is give it a name. So, I can call it my users or something like that. My data. Obviously, again, you want to be somewhat meaningful with it. And then we need to point to the file. So instead of typing in the file path here, it's probably easier to use the button, right? The three-dot button again. Navigate to your training programs folder and find that vips.csv file. All right, once you find that, give it a click. Now, just like our run application action, this could potentially be a problem, right? Because at the moment, it's pointing to this file that's a very distinct location on my machine, right? So if I try to run this test on another machine, it's going to try to look in that location, and unless I'm logged in as Jay Branham, and unless that VIP's file is on my desktop in training programs, then this will break my data, right? So the next option here, this little checkbox, is not a bad one to copy the file to the project. Now the path doesn't change right away, but it will into a relative one. What this basically does, it just copy pastes, right? So it copies the file at this location, and it's going to paste it inside of my project. So it'll be a new file that exists inside my project, not really external anymore. Now this is a good idea if you plan to migrate your test later, which is, I would say, pretty much a guarantee, right? You're going to run the test somewhere else maybe. So it's not a bad idea to choose that copy file to project. Just keep in mind that if I change the original, that will no longer have an effect. I have to change the new one, and you'll see it here in a second. I'll show it to you. The other options, use header and auto load data. You definitely just want to keep those selected. I really don't see any use case for not selecting those. So to be quite honest, I don't know why we even give you the option, because you definitely want the latest and greatest data. So when you open your test suite, you want it to auto load in case there's been any updates. I don't see any benefit to not doing that. But these last two here are a little bit more convoluted. You can only access these once you hit apply. So it tells you that in the little warning there. And we have options of mask and label. So mask is if I want to hide something from my report. Right? Maybe it's a password in my data source. Right? My CSV file has passwords in it. So if you drop this down, you'll see all the different columns of your data source. And you can pick one or two or three or as many as you want to mask. Now, anyone who has access to that data source can still see the plain text value. Obviously, anyone who has access to the project can still see the plain text value, but it won't show up in your reporting, which, reports are a bit more promiscuous, let's say. They get uploaded to dashboards, they get emailed around. So the idea here is just to hide sensitive data from that report artifact that, again, gets around a little bit more than the project will. All right, and then the label is pretty self-explanatory, really. If I don't select the label, it's basically going to say, okay, this is iteration 1 of my data. This is iteration 2 of my data, iteration 3. As opposed to if I choose one of these, then let's say the first name, right, then it's going to be, this is using Jay, this is using Tom, this is using Chris, right? It's going to say a bunch of first names. So, just not really important, I guess, but it makes it a bit flashier than just 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's it. So really all we needed to do, right, is give it a name and point to a file. That's the bare minimum. And you're done. You can click OK. And what we should see is basically a table now. Now what's cool is if I need to add anything to this or change anything or remove something, I can actually do it directly in this view now. So the data source menu, if I right click and go to data source, I can come in here and delete rows or insert new rows, change values. I don't have to go to the CSV file anymore to do that. Speaking of that CSV file, because I chose the, let me just show you here, because I had to click OK for it to actually show up there, but you'll notice it is actually a file that gets added to my project. Now you won't see it unless I have this little show all files button clicked, otherwise it'll be invisible. All right, but that is actually that carbon copy I mentioned. So the original one is no longer good. If I want to edit it, I got to edit this copied version. Just a little heads up. Again, let me go back into my data source menu here. So right click in data source. There's my table, and that is step 2. Step 3, our final step, can be the easiest one if you named your variables the same exact thing as you named your column headers. So my columns are called var first name, var last name, var department, so on. I also named my variables that. And what I'm going to do is go next to the data source tab, to this data binding tab. And it's also in the right click menu, so data source, data binding. But they live right next to each other, so it doesn't really matter how you get there. Okay, and data binding is going to say, all right, you have this first name column. What is that going to connect to, right? What are we going to bind it to? Which variable? And if you get to the right side here and drop it down, you'll see you can pick. Okay, first name column goes to add one user modules first name variable. All right, so you just basically make that connection. Now, if you did give them the same names, then that's an easy step because you have this little auto bind button. Notice even though I capitalized the N here, it's not case sensitive. So the column wasn't capitalized, but they're the same word, same letters. So that worked. Okay, so if you don't have the same name conventions, you do have to go through one by one here, first name to first name, last name to last name, department to department, and age to age. But, if you're only doing 4 variables, not a big deal. If you're doing, 100 variables, then probably a good idea that you maintain the same name, and that way you can just do one click and be done. And that's it. That's data binding. So step 3, make sure these guys are connected up. And when I click OK down here, we will then have a data-driven test. So I'm going to click OK. And what you can see is that those unbound variables should become bound, unless you missed one. And our data, the data source name we gave it shows up, and then rows 5 here. Now, at this point, instead of right-clicking and going to data source or clicking the button, you can actually just double-click right here on the icon there, and that'll take you right to that same menu. It's a little bit faster maybe, but there you go. Now, this changes how my test behaves quite a bit, actually. So, and namely because of the rows, right? The row count here, right, shows me how many first names I have, how many last names I have, and so on, is going to basically drive the test to loop, right, to repeat itself. So what's basically going to happen is I'm going to start the app, go to database tab. I'm going to add one user using the first row of my data, right, which I believe is myself, Jay Branham. Right, Jay Branham support 35. Okay, then I'm going to validate, close, and then it's going to start all the way back over at the top. It's going to start app again, go to database tab, add one user with the second row of data, validate, close, start over. Start, go to tab, third row of data, validate, close, all the way till 5, right? And so we're basically, if I want to make this thing run 100 times, I don't even have to have access to the project anymore. I can just edit that CSV file somehow and add 95 more people, and that's going to cause this to loop 100 times at that point. So it's cool because it truly is, it's data driven. It's driving your test. Changing your data will change your test, basically. Okay, now the design's a little weird, right? So each time we're starting the app and closing the app. Now that's not a bad idea, actually. So I want to, before we run it here real quick, I just want to sprinkle in one little best practice. And again, this isn't really a Ranorex thing. It's more of just automation in general. And that is the idea of what we call atomic test cases. Atomic test case design. Now, I like Sauce Labs. They do a pretty good, basic write-up about it. So I'm going to steal their documentation for a second. But if you look it up, right, this is pretty known methodology, atomic test case design. And the idea is that it's perfect for automation. The idea is you want your test cases to be small, meaning that they should only get in and test one thing. Okay, in our case, right, our add one user, it gets in, it does only the steps necessary to add a user, it makes sure that works, and then it gets out, right? It exits. What you don't want to do is have a test case that has too many different types of validations, right? Too many different types of tests. Because then when it fails, now you have to dig through the report and say, okay, what part actually failed? Was it validation 1? Was it validation 2? Right? So take, for example, the add one user. If that fails, I know, okay, something's wrong with adding a user. However, if I had, let's say I added a user while I was recording and then I validated it and then I deleted the user and I validated that also, well, now technically that's two separate tests, right? So when that test case fails, I have to find out, is it the add part that's the problem or is it the delete part that's the problem? Okay, so keeping it small means it should get in, test one thing, and get out. And it should just do only the minimum that it needs to do, nothing extra. It also gives you faster results, right? And atomic is really where we enforce that. The atomic, let's say, property is where we really focus on it should only test a single feature, nothing else. And kind of, they go hand in hand, right? But atomic means, yeah, only one feature. That way, if it fails, we know exactly what failed. This one is probably the most important, honestly. Autonomous is that I should never have a test case that relies on another test case. So, right, if I have a test case, I want it to really start from the beginning, do what it needs to do, and then even close out gracefully. What I don't want is, test case 1, let's say, creates a user, and test case 2 deletes the user, but test case 2 relies on test case 1, right? Now, it may sound counterintuitive, and really it is, but it makes sense. So let's say that test case 1's create a user, even though test case 2's delete the user, I'm going to have the steps in there to create the user as well. Now, I know, again, that goes back to, well, now it's no longer atomic because you're doing both, but I'm not going to test, or I'm not going to validate anything about the creation in the second test case. I'm only going to validate the deletion part. So that should be the only part that fails, hopefully. It's hard to wrap your head around, but the idea here is that once you build a dependency, right? Let's say test case 2 depends on test case 1, then I can no longer run them independently, right? I have to run them as a team. And this, further down the road, when you really start scaling out your testing, and you want to be able to run things independently. Creating a dependency does exactly that, right? It creates more complexity. It means that I can't just run these things separately on separate machines. Now I got to think about, right, which test cases rely on each other. So the better design is to try and avoid that as much as you can. It's not the easiest thing in the world usually to come up with that decision or how to go about it. But a general rule of thumb is like we're doing here. We're starting the app and closing the app each time. So even with data-driven tests, right, it mentions that at the end that does not create potential conflicts with other tests over the same data, right? And it should use its own data. Well, it kind of goes in hand with this idea that, okay, this thing is going to be looping, right? So if my test, my row number 3, let's say, has bad username in it, maybe it's alphanumeric, and the field only supports alphabetical characters in the name. So for whatever reason, row number 3 fails. Okay, if I was adding every user, at the same time, right? I start the app once and then I add a bunch of users and then close the app. That might run into an issue. All right, but now the way it's designed is that even if row 3 goes bad, our validation fails, we're still going to close the app and start over. Okay, so it's kind of, hopefully this is making some sense. I know it's very confusing at first, really. Even when I'm saying it, I'm confusing myself sometimes. But the idea here is, right, you get in from scratch, you do what you need to do, and you exit gracefully. And a big part of that is error behavior. So this is kind of a little tangential topic, but it makes sense here. The way things are right now, if my row 3 fails, my validation fails, let's say, I'm not going to close the app, actually. So by default, Ranorex will basically stop in its tracks when there's an error. And therefore, my next iteration won't be able to pick up. All right, so row 3 breaking will break everything else. All right, it won't be able to do row 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 99, right? So I don't want that. I want to avoid that kind of situation. And so one thing that I like to introduce here, it's kind of a tangent, but it is important, and this is a good time to talk about it, is what we call setup and teardown regions. So real quick, back to the slides here. You have the ability to create in a test case what are known as setup and teardown regions. And setup is basically pointless. It doesn't do anything special. It just looks fancy, I guess. Teardown is the one you want to remember. So you can even forget about setup for all I care. It doesn't do anything special. A teardown section is a section in your test case where you can put modules, and these modules will always run no matter what happens. Okay, so this hopefully will make more sense once we do it here, but let me show you how to create these, and actually do it. Creating is pretty simple. You come to the test case here, you right click, and you will see add setup, add teardown. Again, setup is basically just useless. It doesn't do anything special, but teardown, you definitely want to have those in each test case. Each test case should have a teardown. So I'll go ahead and create 2 of them here, right? One for test case 1, one for test case 2. And then you're going to put a module in there, one or many, right, by just dragging and dropping it like it's a folder. And if you do it right, you should see the little indentation there. Again, kind of like everything else in Ranorex, there's a tree view kind of thing going on here. And I want to close app here and drag it into teardown as well. Now you could put more than one module in here, but the idea is that now we start app, go to database tab. Row 3 of add one user has trouble. We won't do the validation. Right? If an action breaks here, we won't continue on, but we will make sure to at least close the app. Okay, so the idea of teardown is to exit gracefully, right, so that the next iteration can pick up and start the app. So it's going to be things like log out, maybe clearing a database, clearing cookies, clearing cache, all that kind of cleanup stuff. And this, again, kind of goes hand in hand with that atomic test case design, because a graceful exit, right, a good error behavior is required, particularly with the data-driven test, because we're looping it, so that we don't break, our subsequent loops. Right? We don't break. Row 4 shouldn't have a problem just because row 3 had a problem, basically, is what it comes down to. And this is a simple example of that, but because we're starting and closing each time, we're kind of wiping the memory and everything. When we do that, we know that, one iteration isn't going to break all the other iterations. And really that, this is kind of the hardest part of automation, besides learning the tool, is to start thinking this way. What I usually say is thinking like the machine, because, sometimes it's not so easy to wrap your head around, to be quite honest. But hopefully this simple example gives you an idea of why teardown is important. We'll talk about more. There's some more types of error behavior we can do, but for now, with the basics, it's definitely a good time to introduce this one, the teardown section, because every test case should have a teardown. At the very least, closing the application, right? Okay, I digress. Again, a little tangent, but it's a good place to introduce it. I'm going to run this, and you'll see the data-driven test. Now, I know, again, some of you might have trouble with the running part, so maybe all the excitement is on my side here, but basically what we'll see, right, is that this thing will now loop, and each time it's going to use different data, different first names, different last names. Pay special attention to the department, because that one's, I think, the coolest, because that's actually for data driving the object recognition in that one. Which, again, we could emulate that for the gender selection as well, but I wanted to not make it too tricky at first here. Just so happens we have a data source of all males. Matter of fact, anyone who can figure out where these names are coming from gets extra bonus points. It's an older movie, but you might recognize some of the names. Now, maybe 5 iterations is overkill, but you can see that looping behavior, and notice each time we do close the app and launch it again. Seems kind of silly, right? But it is actually a good idea. So this last name here usually is what piques people's memory on the movie. Though it is an American movie, so I don't know if it's as popular there in the UK. There we go. So we got it all typed in here. Oh, bear with me a second. My headset's trying to die on me. I got to plug it in real fast. All right. So we had our data-driven test. I don't see any guesses. I don't see any guesses on the movie there, so I'll let you.
Sorry, was it Office Space?
Ah, very good. Someone always gets it. Very, very good. Yeah, so if you haven't seen that yet, it's required viewing, especially if you're on the QA team or any kind of software for that matter. Very good. Yeah, that's a great movie. A funny one. I gotta bust it out again. It's been a while. There you go. So you see the difference that in our report, we basically ran the same steps, but each time we changed the values. Now, of course, this test didn't really do anything special between these different values, right? There was always a first name, always a last name. What I could do, right, is start putting in bad data. Like I said, maybe a numerical value for a name and see how that responds. All right, at the moment, it's all happy path. But just to give you the idea of kind of how the data-driven thing works, right, it kind of loops things now. That is the real key or the real takeaway. Now, there's other ways to arrange this. I want to just do a quick example. You guys don't have to do this one with me, but I always get the question, okay, well, what if we do want to do all the users at once? Instead of starting and closing each time, only doing one, what would that look like? And that's where I want to introduce the idea of the smart folder. So what a smart folder is, and again, you don't have to do this part with me, but I'm going to create a new test case. Maybe you want to just to get the muscle memory. And instead of add one user, this is going to be add all users test case as the name. And yeah, so there's going to be a little bit of a difference here. I'm still going to start the application, obviously. I'm still going to go to the database tab. And here is where I want to do the looping. So if I wanted to just loop one module or maybe a couple modules, right, just a certain amount of steps, but keep some sequential, right? So some happen only once, but others happen multiple times. That's where I'm going to use what's called a smart folder. So I have to add that to my test case by, again, the context menu here is my favorite, but you also have the add drop down. Just a little too separated for my liking. I can add a smart folder. And these basically just act like test cases in that I can attach a data source, and that's going to cause anything inside to loop, just like it did up here. Right? Up here, we're looping the whole test case. In here, if I just throw one module inside, like add one user, right, it's only going to loop that. So we're not done yet, but right, what else would I do? I would, well, I can't just validate one anymore because that is going to be a problem because we're actually adding 5, or who knows how many we're adding, right? It all depends on our number of rows. So I'd have to make a new module instead of validate one. So I'll just leave it out for now and just do close app. Okay, but the point I want to get across here is that there is no data source on the test case, which means everything's going to happen sequentially, one time. Start the app, go to database tab, then we hit our smart folder, and on the smart folder, I'm going to connect a data source, right, just like we did up there. Now I already have one, so I don't need to create a new one. I can just recycle it, right, reuse it, which by the way you can do. All right, so I just need to set it to my users and then do the quick data binding here. And okay, so just steps 2 and 3 really. And this is now a data-driven smart folder. And so it will cause it to loop anything inside it. Now we only have one module inside, but that's all we need. But you see the difference, right? Data source connected to the test case means the whole test case loops. Data source connected to just a internal smart folder here means only those steps, only those modules will loop. So you can come up with pretty much any scenario you could think of. Right? It's even possible to have smart folders inside of smart folders, so you can have loops inside of loops. Right? Now, let's not get too complicated there, maybe, but you can kind of see the idea, hopefully. Now, let's not forget that close app should be a teardown. Another way to move it to teardown is instead of creating one and dragging it in, you can just grab a module, right-click it, and say move to teardown. There you go. So that's the difference. I'll quickly run it, and you'll see the difference right away. I'm going to uncheck open close. I'm going to uncheck add user. These little check boxes, by the way, determine what runs. if that's not obvious. And I'm going to run just this guy. So we will see the app start once, right? Go to database tab once, and then here we get into our looping. So a bit different, right? And like I said, we couldn't use the validate one user module because that only checks for a one. It'd work the first iteration, but it wouldn't work for anything else. So we need to get creative there. Either create a new module that can see the number of rows in our data source and base it on that would be a good idea. But we have to get a little creative, right? We have to create a variable for the expected value of that validation, perhaps. But yeah, I won't maybe run the whole thing here, but you can kind of see the difference, right? It's adding all users now in the same instance of the app. So pretty neat. I'll go ahead and stop it there to buy us a few more minutes, though. And yeah, that's pretty much data-driven in a nutshell. I guess what else? One thing I didn't point out is that, excuse me, right? We decided to mask age, or I did. So nowhere in here should I ever be able to see the age value. So again, that just lets you hide, things like passwords and stuff like that. That mask option when we set up our data source. There you go, data-driven in a nutshell. Now, obviously, you could see that there is some level of complexity that can be added here with this looping. So there's lots of things to consider just beyond, adding the data. A lot of times you got to think about, okay, what steps are able to be looped, right? It comes down to separating the modules in the right way. So there's a lot of moving parts basically, but hopefully keeping it simple for now will help you get your head wrapped around it. And that's data driven. And we have the basics basically, guys. We have enough to be dangerous anyway. So recording, categorizing modules, building test cases, and building data driven test cases is really 80%, more than that maybe, of what you're going to be doing every day. So we already have enough to be dangerous. Having said that, there is a quick section here that's really just me demonstrating. It's a really short one. Not really anything hands-on here, but some recorder best practices before we move on from the basics. And I just want to reiterate some of these. A lot of them are common sense, honestly. I even heard a few of you mentioning I'm just closing down things I don't need. We start there, right? If you're going to do a recording, close down everything you don't need. All right, it could be part of the reason you're getting performance issues, that you have too many things running. It's also, you're more likely to make a mistake, because when I'm recording, every single thing I do is going to be captured. So if I get a message from a colleague and reply to that, I want to make sure to pause basically, but if I forget to pause, once I'm in pause, I can start doing things, right? And it's not going to be recorded. But if you forget about that and you just start, let's say I go to minimize GoToMeeting or something, all right, things like that, things you probably won't even notice you're doing until you do it. And it's very common that you get into recording, you start cleaning some things up, let's say minimizing applications, closing applications, and you don't realize that, hey, I'm recording all that, and that is not something I need in my test, right? So it's very, very common that happens. Don't beat yourself up. I still do it, and I've been doing this for a long time now, and I still do it myself. So the best way, or one of the best ways you can avoid that, is close down. Close down all those chat applications, close down Facebook and all that. Don't make sure anything is going to interrupt you, basically, and steal your attention away, because you end up making actions you don't need sometimes. And this goes along hand in hand with that, is doing a quick dry run. Right, we did this before we started recording against that demo app. I opened it up, and I'm thinking to myself the whole time, okay, what are the minimum set of steps I need? So I'm kind of just, thinking in my mind, and that's good too, because again, you run into fields like that age field or maybe the drop down, and you could think to yourself, okay, I don't want to use the field, I want to use the button for the drop down. I don't want to click the age field because then I have to backspace. I want to double click it. Things like that. You can find those, discover those kind of things before you hit the record button, and therefore you're less likely to make a mistake. Again, it sounds like a waste of time, but honestly, doing it as close to right the first time as you can means you're going to have to do less editing, less fixing, which is a very time-consuming thing, believe it or not. Trying to figure out what actions do I need, what actions don't I need. That is very time-consuming, actually. And on that note, there's also this: keep the recording short and simple. Don't try to record too much. I see this all the time. You may have a very complex scenario. You come in and you try to record all 100 steps of that complex scenario from start to finish in one go. Always remember that you can stop recording, all right, and then pick up where you left off by just hitting record again. So it's, you record, you add a step, maybe a few steps, you hit stop, and you play back what you got, just making sure that those few steps you recorded work. And then once you're good, right, once you know, yep, we can keep going, you just hit record to pick up where you left off. So again, this sounds, kind of like a waste of time. You're like, well, I should just be able to go from start to finish, right? Yes, in most cases that is the case. The problem you run into is that if you don't record in short bursts like this, right, let's say 10, 20 steps max before you just play it back and make sure it works. If you try to record 100 or 200 steps and then you have an issue, now instead of just looking at a small set of 10 or 20 steps, you're looking at 100 or 200. So now you got to find out where in this big mess of actions is the problem, right? It's a little bit harder to find, a little bit harder to fix. So at least in the beginning, right, maybe keep your recording kind of in a burst, right, short and sweet. And you always want to just play it back to make sure, if I play it back, I should get to the same state that I was in. If I don't, then I have a problem. So that's kind of the whole idea. Again, a lot of this stuff sounds maybe common sense, but I promise, and at least at first it sounds like some of it's a waste of time, but if you just start this way, once you get really comfortable with it, once you get really comfortable with recording and stuff like that, you can start not caring about this stuff as much. But for now, I recommend just kind of keeping these best practices in mind. This last one is actually particular to Ranorex, so just a nuance in our tool is that while you're recording, just remember to click, and I'll show you why you want to do that. I have a quick example here. Let's say, let me quickly move this app to my, here we go. I'm going to move it to my desktop here so I can grab it real quick. You guys don't have this app, so you won't be able to do it with me. But I want to show you what happens if I'm going to create a new module here, a new recording one. Let's say, pretend I just started out on a new project. And, I'd create the action to launch this app. Let's pretend I already did that. And then I'm going to start recording against this thing. So when I hit record, and this is a hard habit to break sometimes, but remember, I always say you want to get that red border and then click on the object and remember to click. But you might forget that, right? And you say, oh, I already have focus in my input field there, my first name field, so I can just start typing. All right, and instead of clicking the last name field, I'm just going to use the tab button. I know tab will get me to the next field, so good enough for me. And then I'll type again. Maybe I use tab again to get to the add button. And instead of clicking that, I press enter. Basically, I'm using the keyboard. And this is a hard habit to break. I mean, when I first came to Ranorex, I tried to do everything I could by keyboard shortcuts, whether it was writing an email or anything. And the same thing when I was doing any kind of manual testing is I try to do it as fast as possible. The issue with creating a test in that way, if I hit stop, you'll kind of see the issue here, is that every object, right, it didn't capture individual objects anymore. Every object is pointing to this form VIP application believe it or not, this is only recent that we updated that. Before, it would just point to nothing. It would just say no item. It said, well, you didn't target anything. You just typed the word JSON into space, basically. It didn't know that I had the focus in there. It just know that I had started typing the word JSON. So at least now we're targeting some object. So that was an update that we added, but it's still not great. What I'm targeting here is the whole application. If I right click on this little object down here and say highlight, you'll see what I mean, right? It's the whole form. Okay, so I may get lucky, right? And this may be runnable, but so many things can break about it, right? What if I add a middle name field in here? Well, suddenly JSON and then tab is not going to take me to last name anymore. It's going to take me to the middle name, and I'm going to be typing my last name into the middle name field. Okay, or maybe the focus doesn't start in the first name field anymore. Maybe they change that. And the point is, there's lots of things. Just a small update to the application might break everything. Now, the difference is if I remember to click, it sounds tedious, right? But I'm going to click into first name field and then type first name. And I'm going to stop myself from using the tab button. Again, it's a hard habit to break if you're one of those people like me. But I'm going to click into the last name field and then type in my last name. And then, I'll click the add button. So basically same scenario. But look at the difference. We have now the individual objects. This is important because, again, Ranorex for every action says, can I find this thing? Yes, I can. Okay, click it. Again, before it was the whole form. So the only kind of timing, the only kind of thinking Ranorex says is the form there? Yes, it is. Okay, type JSON. Right now we actually wait on the individual objects, and that's not so important for like a static app like this, where all the objects are, there at the very beginning. But certainly for web applications, where certain elements may not be rendered until later, right? That's pretty common on web. You see different parts of the app loading first, right? That really becomes important that we capture the individual object, not just the whole application. Because now we're going to wait on that individual object to be available before we do the action. This is a really important part, and we're going to talk about it a lot tomorrow, the way this kind of behavior works. But I'll just leave it at that. Remember to click. That's a big one, and because it's so unique to Ranorex, I like to say, make a little post-it note that says, Ranorex, make sure you click. Put that on your monitor, because, again, this is one that gets me all the time because I had such a bad habit. Well, not a bad habit, but a different habit, let's say, of using the keyboard a lot to navigate through a UI. But try to break that habit if you have it. Otherwise, you're going to get, you might get some weird actions. All right, that's it for the best practice. I promised it was a short section, right? Just some quick reminders, basically, and particularly with the recorder. And that brings us into the last topic of today. We got about 45 minutes left, so we're tracking right on time. This should take us all the way to the end. We're going to talk about smart actions. So what are these? Smart actions are a codeless approach, but it's not recording. So there's one other codeless approach in Ranorex besides recording, and that is to use dragging and dropping, basically. And you'll see what I mean here in a second when we do the hands-on. But let's talk about what